Hello, and welcome to another video of Sean's Check-In. Feel free to follow all of my videos over on my professional Facebook page, Sean P. Daughtry, LICSW, or over on my YouTube channel, Sean's Check-In or Sean's Little Check-In. Thank you again for tuning in for those of you who are repeat viewers. What I wanted to talk about today is something that I haven't read about in a very long time, but I do think it's an interesting and important topic, and it's quite an indicator of many things about a person's well-being. And that's something that I read about many years ago. It's this concept called Fantasies of Grandeur. I think it's a pretty human kind of thing to do, is fantasize about grandeur in some way or another. And I'll say what I mean by that in a moment. But where I did read about this concept many years ago is in a classic self-help psychological book, if you will, called The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. And I think it came out around 1982 or so. So coming up to about 40 years ago, just about. It's an old classic book. Very psychodynamic. Short book, though. She did write it for a general wide audience. And she talked in that about fantasy. She talked about many things. And talked about a concept of having a healthy sense of self. In her psychodynamic way, she talked about that versus having depression and a lack of sense of self that goes with that. She really elaborated on that. But one kind of thought process that she touched upon that I thought was fascinating and relevant is fantasies of grandeur. So basically, what do I mean by fantasies of grandeur? And I've got cheat sheet notes here I'm looking down at periodically to keep me focused here. So what I jotted out before starting this video today is I defined fantasies of grandeur as thoughts of being in a position of power or over others, having extra powers somehow, such as being a superhero, and or having high privilege or as expressed through owning much material goods, such as living in a castle or a mansion. So basically having extra large or grand, if you will, existence, fantasizing that you're living in some kind of grand extra existence, and therefore you are extra particularly special, be it through power or privilege, or a combination thereof, which involves or may involve lots of material goods, or just extra powers, such as a superhero, so magical powers. There may be a magical component, or just a political component where one is somehow a powerful leader, whether it be of a corporation or a religious organization, or having a kingdom that you are ruling over. And such. So I think that's a workable definition, maybe not a perfect one, but a workable one to go from in terms of this concept I wanted to talk about today. Now, fantasies of grandeur are often a part of daydreams, particularly for children and young adults, although they certainly can be and are here and there for adults as well, where they serve a purpose in adulthood for sheer entertainment or as a means to get through a difficult, stressful time by going into some fantasizing to just smooth out one's feeling state and regulate it better while dealing with a lot of stress. It's just a nice self-distractor, fantasizing, maybe similar to any number of other things we do to self-distract and help cope with a difficult, stressful situation, which might entail doing something else that's relaxing, whether it be having a glass of wine or meditating, getting online and doing something fun online, or watching a movie or what have you. And all of those different distractors to varying degrees are harmless to maybe not so healthy to some of them can be extremely unhealthy, like if it's heavy drug use. So fantasizing is in that mix of coping uh, uh, for in a stressful situation. It's a coping strategy, if you will. So fantasizing here and there is fine to do, and daydreaming, that is part of that. Um, and it's especially common in childhood to daydream, as with fantasies of grandeur being in the mix of daydreaming. I mean, daydreaming itself can be for other things too. That's not necessarily fantasizing about grandeur. It just may be your mind wandering off, and you are thinking about being in a pleasant, harmless situation, like out in a field of flowers or something. So daydreaming is pretty broad, and fantasizing grandly, or having a fantasy of grandeur, is sort of a theme, if you will, that can happen within daydreaming. Daydreaming itself is very much a helpful coping strategy in ways that I just explained. And also, it's been written about. I remember in a Psychology Today ad some years ago that daydreaming has been helpful around people eventually forming more clear goals that start out as daydreams, and then they get more and more over time concentrated into something more realistic you can pursue and complete successfully, but at first started out as a daydream. Same with fantasizing. So fantasies of grandeur even could possibly distill down to something realistic. And as I said, their fantasies of grandeur are common in childhood. And they certainly can be more intense and more common and prevalent for children that are especially coping with being in disempowering, invalidating environments. So if their parents around them or the school they're in are presenting very difficult environments where they don't feel as children that they're being empowered to get to know what's important to them, and that they are important, worthwhile people and such. They can go into, any of us, that is, as a child, if this is happening to us, we can go into a retreat inside to our fantasy life, into our minds, where no one can encroach. Even if our bodies are being encroached on and we're not being respected physically around us and valued physically around us, we can retreat into our fantasy lives and have some sense there of doing well. And to compensate for feeling so small and belittled around us, for example, we can then compensate by thinking about ourselves in some kind of grand situation where we actually have great power, where we actually have great privilege, and maybe somehow or another we're extra special because we feel so unspecial and insignificant in our daily lives that we're actually coping with in outer reality. So it's often an indicator too, although I don't know if studies have been done around this, but I have found in my experience it to be an indicator that if someone lives in a fantasy life a lot that's full of grandness, that's often somehow a compensatory response to the outer environment, or historically at some point, particularly in childhood, having been pretty problematic and invalidating. So I just wanted to put that out there about this concept of fantasies of grandeur. I think that's why fantasies of grandeur are why all sorts of great movies that certainly express grandeur, whether it be through wealth or superpowers, or privilege or what have you, are so popular for so many people, is that they play into this sense as human beings of feeling somehow not enough and not very valid. That so many people, to some extent, to varying degrees, have endured, particularly during childhood and adolescence and young adulthood. It's good to see the entertainment value as much as possible in grand, larger than life fantasies or expressions thereof, such as in art, such as in movies, as I just referenced, or other kinds of art, as much as possible. It gets to be a slippery slope for people who, in adulthood in particular, go into trying to really live and manifest their fantasies of grandeur at all costs, where they're determined to be a head leader over others, um, or a big star at the expense of others around them in terms of respectfully, reciprocally honoring others around as equal, worthwhile people too. It just gets very dicey with that for some people. And those people are people who are narcissistically inclined and tend to be on the very much the narcissism spectrum, which at the extreme end is called narcissistic personality disorder, which is a diagnosis in the DSM-5. But a lot of people don't meet necessarily all that criteria to still be more on the narcissism spectrum, which comes from a combination in terms of being high on the narcissism spectrum. That comes from a combination of living in a very invalidating environment, such as with one or more parents who themselves are very narcissistic and therefore came across as so self-centered and treated their own child or children as more extensions of themselves to please them. There's been a lot written about there. So that's one example of how that can happen. But people who are more narcissistic apparently are more temperamentally inclined by their inborn temperament, that is, and constitution, to become narcissistic, combined with an invalidating environment. And again, there's been a lot of writing on that. But I just wanted to touch upon how fantasies of grandeur and playing those fantasies of grandeur out for some people who really work hard at becoming bigger than life, than how they feel in life, at the expense of others, such as becoming a CEO who then is very ruthless to get to there, or somewhere high up in politics into elected office or what have you, or high in Hollywood as a big famous actor or producer or something. Along the way, with that kind of ambition, if a person is more narcissistically inclined because of reasons that I stated, it gets to be like stepping on heads a lot of other people to climb that ladder. And many people, I'm not saying everyone by any means, but many people who express these fantasies of grandeur into reality, into these high positions of power and or privilege and or material wealth, any combination thereof, have often done a lot of emotional harm to others and made a lot of hard, ambitious choices that have been rather hurtful to others for them to get to that place. So the degree often is more inclination towards narcissism, that extreme, intense self-centeredness, and ruthlessness and of need for power and validation for oneself from the outside. That tends to be higher for others, many people who get to those high places through manifesting these fantasies of grandeur, which is what started out for them as fantasy, even though many of us have fantasies of grandeur, particularly often in childhood, depending, of course, how our environments are. I did put here some notes about what narcissism is. What do I mean by that? It's a pretty complex disorder, if you will, at its extreme, or actually more than a disorder, I should say, a pattern of relational style by a person to others around them. But some basic fundamental concepts are that it's a sense of self that feels small to completely empty inside for a person. And the person feels very insecure in their world around them. And they pursue external validation to create a sense and maintain a sense of self that is false, because it is dependent on external validation to keep feeling like it exists. So to keep feeling like your own sense of self exists, as opposed to from this more internal place of understanding of the 8 C's of self, which I've referenced many times before in other videos, that is naturally there if you tune into it, and practice at living from that place with other people. But that can be harder to do and access for those who are more on the narcissism spectrum and have so early on in age, usually often between 2 to 3 years of age, maybe even earlier than that, where you already started relating to the world extremely differently from a place of poor frustration tolerance, need for constant attention, need for validation from others, often need for more control. That can often exhibit very early in childhood, as I just touched upon, and manifest later over time. Not always, but often as narcissistic tendencies. Again, people after adolescence can outgrow that, and they don't seem so narcissistically inclined at all. And so there's just that related topic of narcissism in relation to this topic of fantasies of grandeur, and how people manifest fantasies of grandeur versus just so many of us just have them as a way to manage in life, particularly in childhood and then here and there in adulthood. So there's that there. It is important, that's it. My final point here from my notes is it's important, as I said in my previous video, to cultivate an inner life as much as possible. And an inner life that isn't so based on a sense of finding ways to get more validation through spending a lot of time, for example, having fantasies of grandeur, and then for some trying to then manifest those fantasies of grandeur. It's important to cultivate an inner life in other ways of just how it feels good to be connected as yet another person in the environment around oneself that's an affirming, positive environment, hence cultivating positive connections with friends and family members, where family members are to be had, if you have any, that are reciprocal, kind people. Fostering interests that are genuine, such as positive hobbies, pursuing knowledge that it feels satisfying to pursue, that is more focused on reciprocity in the world with oneself and the world around you, and also just with yourself, believing from a place of that you are enough as you are. As a human being, you are enough, just as you are. And that folds into, ultimately, my final point here is that we as human beings are inherently enough. That is something that along the way in this materialistic culture, all of us do not quite get validated enough to believe that we are inherently good enough and enough, which is in part why so many therapists are busily employed helping people get to that reality that we each are enough as we are. Good parenting involves cultivating that sense in a child that they are enough as they are good enough as they are, regardless of their behaviors. That happens to some degree or another, to varying degrees, with some parents versus others, and with the world around, such as in school, too. That can get lost in school, where it becomes more like you are defined by good deeds, by good grades, by perhaps how much you join in extracurricular activities and all of that achievement stuff that starts to get focused on external validation about being good enough, versus already coming from a sense of, regardless of how you do in school or behave all the time at home, which is going to be, not always good behavior, that you're still inherently good enough. That is something that's a paradigm shift that I think is growing steadily in the culture at large, or cultures at large, but it's also juxtaposed with this old practice of external validation through material gain and power over others and fame, as I touched upon before, that is very much pervasive in cultures. But next to that is this other new paradigm that's starting to happen. So anyhow, I know that's a broad shift from my main topic I started here, Fantasies of Grandeur. And I do want to say that it is natural to have them, and it's entertaining to have them. It's a helpful way to cope. But for those who get particularly attached to fantasies of grandeur and manifesting them as best as possible, that becomes a very slippery slope and can be concerning. And if you see other people you know around you who are doing that, depending on how close you are to them and in their lives, you can participate in giving them other messages of how you care for them regardless of how grand they are, with manifesting those fantasies of grandeur, that they are inherently already a good enough person and you like them and love them for how they are anyway, regardless of the grandness. So that's just some tie-in there. And thank you for listening. And I hope this was helpful and thought-provoking. Take care.